You were never meant to hear this. What I'm about to tell you was buried in the back roads of America, hidden in the Ozark Mountains, where silence and shadow conspire to erase memory. Imagine a cabin so forgotten, so consumed by time, that even the forest seems to have swallowed it whole. Its windows clouded, its door sagging, its walls breathing a secret that no one dared approach for decades. And yet, behind those rotting planks lived a family whose truth was darker than neglect, stranger than isolation, more corrosive than poverty. It was not a story of survival. It was a story of collapse, of bloodlines twisted into knots, of identities blurred until no one could tell where brother ended and father began, where sister ended and mother began. A lineage designed not by chance, but by ritual, by silence, by generational obedience to a law that no outsider ever wrote. You may think this is just another horror of backwoods isolation, a curiosity tucked away in rural America. But it is more than that. It is a mirror, a distorted reflection of what happens when secrecy becomes a system, when family becomes a prison, and when society itself chooses to look away because the truth is too unbearable. In March of 1982, a social worker named Margaret Wilson stepped into that cabin expecting to find poverty. What she found was something no file, no textbook, no training had prepared her for. A gaunt man named Elijah, claiming to raise 3 children with his sister Martha. 3 children whose faces mirrored his own too perfectly, whose eyes carried the same pale gleam, whose very features whispered the unspeakable. When Margaret asked who their mother was, silence fell heavy in the air. Elijah said she was dead, gone in childbirth, never recorded, never seen. But the children's hands clung to Martha, not to Elijah. Their bodies leaned into her as if her presence was the center of their small, warped universe. And Margaret understood a truth she could not yet prove. The children were not nieces and nephews. They were sons and daughters of something unholy. This is the beginning of the Shelton family's secret. But more than that, it is the beginning of your descent. Because to understand them is to understand something about America itself, the way hidden corruption festers, the way silence protects, the way shadows breed monsters that look just like us. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. When Margaret left that cabin for the first time, she thought she was carrying a case file. What she was really carrying was a contagion, the kind of knowledge that infects the mind and will not leave. The road back to town was 27 kilometers of winding dirt, but every bump of the tires only pressed the silence deeper into her chest. She couldn't forget the way the children looked at her, not with fear, not with innocence, but with something alien, as if they belonged to a world she could never understand, a world built inside those decaying walls. Most people would have closed the file right there. Poverty cases were endless. Neglect was everywhere. There was no shortage of children living without heat, without running water, without schools. But Margaret's instincts screamed that this was not the same. These children weren't just victims of neglect. They were the product of a system, one that had been passed down, protected, hidden. They weren't starving. No bruises covered their arms. No chains bound them. And yet, they were prisoners, prisoners of blood, prisoners of loyalty, prisoners of something older than any law. You see, the Shelton family had no records, no birth certificates, no hospital entries, nothing that tied them to the outside world. It was as if they had been erased or had never existed at all, and that is where the danger lies. Because when a family disappears from the eyes of the state, when generations live unrecorded, unchallenged, they begin to create their own law, their own order, their own reality. And in the shadows of that reality, boundaries dissolve. What would make you recoil in horror becomes, to them, survival. What the world calls a crime becomes to them a sacred tradition. Think about it. The further you go into silence, the easier it becomes to confuse right with wrong, blood with destiny. The Sheltons did not need chain. They had belief, they had ritual, they had the story their parents told them about purity and corruption, about the danger of outsiders, about the sanctity of keeping blood clean. And once that story takes root, it doesn't just guide behavior, it rewrites it. Children grow up not questioning the boundaries of family, but dissolving them entirely. This is not just the Shelton story. This is the story of hidden dynasties, cults of silence, bloodlines that guard their secrets so fiercely they become their own religion. And once you've heard it, you begin to wonder, how many cabins like this exist? How many shadows hide families erased from the records, still worshiping their own corruption as if it were sacred? That is the question Margaret carried back with her that night, a question that would not sleep. The second time Margaret returned to the Shelton cabin, she did not go alone. She brought with her a sheriff's deputy and a pediatrician, Dr. Hayes. That detail matters, because what unfolded next was not just her suspicion. It was witnessed, documented, undeniable. And yet, the truth still felt like something no report could fully capture. The air was colder that morning, the ground half-thawed, soft under the boots of the deputy as they approached the sagging porch. Elijah stood at the door like a sentinel, his face unreadable, his body gaunt but unshaken. His eyes, pale, unblinking, watched them not as guests, not even as threats, but as trespassers on a kingdom that did not belong to the outside world. Behind him, Martha hovered like a shadow, her gaze fixed on the dirt, her voice absent. Then came the children. They emerged from the gloom of the cabin like echoes of Elijah himself, thin, pale, marked not by bruises, but by sameness. Their eyes wide but hollow, their movements slow, mechanical. Thomas, the oldest, carried a scar across his forearm that looked as if it had been carved by accident or punishment. Sudi's eye turned inward, untreated, her teeth rotting quietly in her mouth. Little Jacob, barely 5, clung to Martha with a grip so desperate it seemed he was afraid she might vanish if he let go. And yet none of them spoke, not a single word of welcome, fear, or protest. Dr. Hayes examined them, his hands steady but his face tightening with each passing moment. Their bodies told a story without saying it. Stunted growth, untreated conditions, development frozen as if the very air of the cabin had calcified them. Not bruised, not starving, something worse, grown like plants in darkness, twisted not by violence but by isolation. Hayes later whispered to Margaret that these children were not simply neglected. They were shaped, cultivated, raised in an environment designed to keep them small, dependent, silent, and yet still, no evidence, nothing to pin down, no chains on wrists, no signs of beatings, just the eerie sameness, the psychological scars invisible to a system built to measure only broken bones and empty stomachs. Margaret's gut screamed louder. This was not poverty, this was design. This was the product of a belief system. You see, that is the most dangerous prison of all. Not bars, not locks, but ideas. Ideas passed from parent to child, drilled so deep they become blood itself. And in that cabin, Margaret was staring at the living proof of how an idea can shape flesh, bone, and destiny itself. And here is the revelation that should disturb you most. When you looked into those children's eyes, you were not looking at victims. You were looking at the continuation of a system so silent, so self-contained, that it could keep breeding itself forever. That is the legacy of secrecy. It doesn't just hide, it reproduces. The surface story was disturbing enough. A brother and sister, 3 children, a cabin steeped in silence. But Margaret knew instinctively what she was looking at was not just neglect. Not just secrecy, it was inheritance. Something buried in the marrow of that family, stretching back generations. And when she began digging through old records, the cracks widened. There were no birth certificates, no hospital logs, no school enrollment. The children didn't exist in the eyes of the state, neither did Elijah nor Martha, except for one thin trace: their parents, Harold and Edith Shelton, dead in a fire in 1973, and with their deaths, all official records stopped. But before the fire, before their disappearance into the wilderness, there were whispers in the county, whispers of a family so withdrawn they treated neighbors like enemies, so suspicious of outsiders that even doctors and pastors stayed away, whispers of a belief system that preached purity. Not the kind of purity you find in religion or morality, no, the darker kind, blood purity. The idea that the family line must remain untouched, unsullied by the corruption of outsiders, that only family could be trusted, that only family could carry on the sacred flame of their name. Do you see the poison? To you, to me, to the outside world, it looks like a grotesque distortion, but to them, it was law. To them, it was a shield against corruption, a fortress against the outside world. Once you accept that story, once you live in it, boundaries disintegrate. The line between brother and husband, sister and mother, child and heir, all of it collapses into the same closed circle. And this is where the darkness multiplies. Elijah and Martha were not inventing something new. They were continuing something old. They had been raised in it. They had been taught that the outside world was a contagion, that government, documentaries, or even neighbors were dangerous, corrupt predators waiting to defile their bloodline. Their parents had built not just a cabin, but a philosophy, a prison of thought that their children could never leave. Think about it carefully. What you call incest, they called purity. What you call isolation, they called protection. What you call abuse, they called tradition. Do you see how dangerous that is? When the very definitions of morality are reversed, when a family can re-script the meaning of reality itself, they create a separate universe where nothing you say can break through. And here is the lesson you must understand, the one most men will never see. Society does this too. Nations do this. Institutions do this. They take corruption, violence, manipulation, and rename it safety, purity, tradition. The Shelton cabin is just a microcosm of something far larger, something that hides not in cabins, but in governments, corporations, churches. The doctrine is the same. Redefine the terms, reverse morality, make the prison invisible. This is why Margaret could feel the truth but could not prove it. She was not confronting a family. She was confronting a system. And systems do not fall easily. The deeper Margaret searched, the more a chilling pattern revealed itself. The Shelton family had not been hidden by accident. They had been hidden because no one wanted to see. For decades, the locals had whispered about them. They saw Elijah's father, Harold, walking into town twice a year for supplies. They noticed how Edith kept her children close, never letting them play with outsiders. They knew the Shelton land was cut off by dirt roads and heavy woods, and they knew not to wander near it. They laughed about those hill people, exchanged rumors over beer, and then did the most dangerous thing of all: nothing. This is how corruption survives, not because it is strong, but because the world around it is weak. It does not need to fight for survival. It only needs your silence, your willingness to look the other way. And silence was exactly what protected the Shelton family. Imagine it. A child never seen at school, never brought to a doctor, never mentioned in official records. Do you think the neighbors didn't notice? Do you think the sheriff's office didn't wonder? Of course they did. But in rural America, where every family carries secrets, where confrontation feels like betrayal, It was easier to pretend ignorance than to drag those shadows into the light. That's their business. That's their land. It ain't my place. Words spoken casually, but they are the very bricks in the wall of secrecy. Do you see the pattern? The Shelton cabin is not unique. The same mechanism protects every hidden abuse, every forbidden ritual, every institution built on corruption, silence, indifference, the willingness of the many to allow the few to rot in their own shadows, so long as it doesn't disturb the surface peace of the community. And here is the truth most men do not want to face. The world you live in operates the same way. Governments cover their tracks, corporations bury their crimes, churches conceal their predators, and the people around them choose silence. Because silence feels safe, because silence feels easier than confrontation. The Shelton children were raised in that silence, molded by it, trapped within it. But so are you. You walk in a world where corruption thrives not because it hides well, but because people refuse to see what is right in front of them. The Shelton family is not just a tragedy in the Ozarks. It is a parable, a warning, a reflection. The question is not, how could they live like that? The question is, where in your life are you living like that, pretending not to see? Margaret's obsession with the Sheltons grew sharper the more she studied the fragments of their past. It wasn't enough to observe the children, to note the scars, the silence, the sameness. She needed roots. She needed to know where this began. And that is when she found the first true crack in their silence, a stack of old county documents buried in archives mentioning Harold and Edith Shelton, the parents of Elijah and Martha, before the fire that supposedly consumed them in 1973. They had been marked as uncooperative, refused medical visits, refused education for their children, refused church attendance, even though in the Ozarks, church was less religion than community. On the surface, they looked like eccentric isolationists. But then came the detail that chilled her. Harold Shelton had once been heard preaching, not in a church, but in whispers to neighbors who listened too long. His sermon was not about God, not about Christ. It was about blood purity. The idea that mixing with outsiders would taint the family, weaken the lineage, destroy the sacred bond of kinship. He spoke of the outside world as a disease, a contagion waiting to infect. Understand this clearly. Elijah and Martha did not invent their twisted reality. They inherited it. They were raised in a doctrine where incest was not sin but salvation, where isolation was not exile but defense, where silence was not weakness but loyalty. This was not dysfunction. It was design. Do you see the shape of it now? The Shelton children weren't simply neglected. They were heirs to an ideology. That is why their eyes looked vacant, not because they were empty, but because they had been filled with a belief so toxic it erased the possibility of another life. And here is the revelation that should strike you hardest. This is how control systems are built, not by force, but by story, not by chains, but by doctrine. Teach a man that the outside world is evil, and he will build his own prison. Teach a woman that loyalty to family is survival, and she will sacrifice her own body to preserve it. Raise children in silence, and they will pass it on as if it were truth itself. The Shelton cabin is not a failure of morality. It is the success of programming. And once you see it there, you begin to see it everywhere, in politics, in religion, in the very stories you were raised on. Because if a family can rewrite morality, so can a nation. The Shelton family was not just a tragedy buried in the Ozarks. It was a blueprint, a small, rotting example of how an entire system can be built on secrecy, reinforced by silence, justified by doctrine, and passed down without resistance. And if you are wise, you will not treat their story as an oddity. You will treat it as a reflection, because what happened in that cabin is happening around you right now in ways you were trained not to notice. Consider this. The Sheltons erased their own existence from official records. No birth certificates, no school enrollment, no medical history. They became invisible to the system by design. But think carefully. How many powerful families, how many institutions operate the same way? How many dynasties rewrite their own history, omit their crimes, burn their scandals before they can ever reach the public eye? The only difference is scale. The Sheltons were peasants in a cabin. The elite who run nations sit in towers, but the principle is identical. Control the narrative, erase the record, bury the truth. Harold Shelton told his children that outsiders were corrupt, that family blood was sacred, that silence was survival. Governments tell you the same thing, only with different words. They tell you your nation must remain pure, your people protected, your enemies demonized. They say outsiders are dangerous, that questioning is betrayal, that obedience is loyalty. And when you obey, when you silence your doubt, when you protect the family of your flag, your church, your corporation, you become just like the Shelton children, vacant-eyed, programmed, carrying forward a doctrine that is not yours, but inherited. Do you see why this matters? The Shelton cabin is America in miniature. A society built on secrecy, on blood, on the belief that corruption can be sanctified if you call it tradition. The family line must stay unbroken, and the silence must stay unchallenged. The ideology must never be questioned, and the price for breaking it, exile, punishment, or worse. This is why the Shelton story was so dangerous to Margaret. She wasn't just confronting neglect. She was confronting a mirror held up to the very system she served. She worked for the state, for the county, for the apparatus meant to protect children. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized the state had been complicit all along. The silence that shielded the Sheltons was the same silence that shields institutions everywhere. And here is the truth most men cannot face. You are in a cabin too. Your walls are not wood, your roof not rusting tin, but you are still living in a system that rewrites truth, erases history, and tells you obedience is survival. The question is, will you stay in it? Margaret's investigation began to feel less like social work and more like archaeology. Each step forward unearthed fragments, hints, and traces of something deliberately buried. She scoured the county archives, library records, even handwritten journals donated to the Historical Society, and slowly the pieces began to form a picture, a doctrine so raw, so grotesque, it could never have survived in daylight. In one box of brittle papers, she found a ledger signed by Harold Shelton's father, dated 1949. It wasn't financial. It wasn't agricultural, it was genealogical. A family tree, hand-drawn, carefully inked, showing names looping into each other in unnatural patterns. Cousins marrying cousins, brothers paired with sisters, branches folding back into the trunk until the tree looked less like lineage and more like a knot, and beneath it, a single phrase scrawled in fading ink: "The circle must never break." That was the creed, the circle, the unbroken line of blood looping endlessly in on itself. To outsiders it was madness. To the Sheltons, it was survival, purity, destiny. But there was more. Tucked among the papers was a pamphlet, mimeographed and yellow with age. It looked like something passed around at secret meetings. Its title was blunt, "On the Preservation of the Sacred Line." The words were crude, but the message was unmistakable. It warned of mongrelization, of outsider sickness, of the danger of foreign blood. It was the rhetoric of supremacists, of eugenicists, stripped of polish and spoken in backwoods bluntness. And yet, it was the same poison. The Shelton family had not created this idea. They had absorbed it, carried it, and distilled it into their own secret gospel. Think about what that means. The Shelton cabin wasn't just an accident of poverty. It was the living continuation of a broader ideology that has haunted America for centuries. Eugenics, blood purity, the obsession with control through inheritance. The Sheltons were not outliers. They were the underground echo of beliefs once spoken openly from podiums, classrooms, even pulpits. This was Margaret's first true revelation. The Shelton doctrine was not family madness. It was family scripture, handed down, written, preserved. And here is the terrifying part. You will not find this doctrine only in the cabins of the forgotten. You will find it in the policies that shaped nations, the institutions that decided who lived, who died, who was sterilized, who was silenced. The Shelton Creed, the circle must never break, is not a relic. It is a mirror, still reflecting into the present. Margaret was no longer dealing with a family. She was staring into the dark, unbroken circle of history itself. Margaret sat in her dim office long after midnight, the papers spread before her like the remains of a ritual. The family tree, the pamphlet, the fragments of whispers that had survived in county records. It all fit together into something far larger than one family, and for the first time, the weight of it pressed against her chest like a warning. This was not just neglect. This was not just abuse. This was doctrine, a system, a circle that had resisted breaking for generations. She realized the truth with a kind of cold clarity. If she tried to intervene, she would not only be confronting Elijah and Martha, she would be tearing at the roots of a belief older than them, stronger than them, a belief that had already outlived fire, exile, and secrecy. This was not just about children trapped in a cabin. It was about a bloodline guarding its own continuity like a fortress, and to break it would be to declare war. Understand the danger. When corruption is generational, when silence has hardened into law, outsiders who try to expose it rarely survive unscathed. You can rescue a child from hunger. You can rescue a child from neglect. But how do you rescue a child from a doctrine that has redefined reality itself? How do you fight a family who believes their prison is their temple? This is the moment Margaret began to sense what most people never see, that the Shelton cabin was just a small node in a much wider network of silence. Think carefully. How many other families, in how many other forgotten corners, were keeping their own circles unbroken? How many communities had whispered and looked away? How many officials had chosen not to dig deeper because they knew the truth was older, darker, more dangerous than they wanted to touch? Here is the lesson. When you pull at one loose thread of forbidden history, it never stops with what you first uncover. It leads deeper to tunnels of ideology that connect to things far bigger than a single case. The Sheltons were not an isolated nightmare. They were a fragment of a hidden order that has always existed, whispering the same command. The circle must never break. And this is where fear enters. Because if Margaret pushed further, if she truly broke that circle, she would not only risk her career, she would risk her life. Margaret knew the time for paper and whispers was over. To truly understand the Shelton Creed, she had to hear it spoken by the ones who lived it. That meant going back to the cabin. She arrived at dusk, when the shadows stretched long and the woods swallowed sound. The cabin looked the same as before, sagging roof, boarded windows, smoke bleeding weakly from a rusted chimney. But as she approached, she realized something had changed. The children, who had always clung silently to the porch, were gone. The air was too still, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Elijah appeared first. He stood in the doorway, tall, rigid, eyes burning with a fire that was not madness but conviction. Behind him, Martha lingered, her hands clenched at her sides, her expression calm in the way of someone who has already chosen obedience. Margaret introduced herself carefully, her voice steady, but Elijah did not flinch. "You've been reading," he said. His tone was not accusation, but recognition. "You've seen the words." Margaret's blood ran cold. She had never told him about the archives, never mentioned the pamphlets or the family tree, but his certainty was absolute. "What I've seen," she answered, "are children who deserve more than silence." Elijah stepped closer, his face hardening. "Silence is not what you think. Silence is protection. The world out there would have us corrupted, broken, turned against each other. Our silence keeps us whole. Our circle keeps us strong." It was the doctrine, spoken not from faded ink, but from living flesh. Margaret realized then that this creed was not abstract. It was alive in their very voices, shaping their every thought. Martha spoke next, softly, almost tenderly. "You think we're prisoners, but you're the prisoner. You're bound to laws, to strangers, to people who would never bleed for you. We only bleed for each other." Margaret tried to counter, but the words clung to her like smoke. She saw in their faces not defiance, but a terrifying peace, the kind of peace that only comes from absolute belief. To them, incest was not violation. It was covenant. Silence was not oppression. It was shield. And to break the circle was not rescue. It was blasphemy. She left the cabin shaken to her core. For the first time, she understood the true depth of the danger. She was not fighting individuals. She was fighting an inherited scripture, a living faith. And faith does not yield to reason. It yields only to force or collapse. The night after Margaret left the cabin, she couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified. The ticking of the clock, the groan of the house settling, the faint rustle of branches outside her window. She told herself it was nerves, the residue of the encounter with Elijah and Martha. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. She was no longer just the watcher. She was being watched. It began subtly. On her drive to work, she noticed an old pickup truck in her rearview mirror. Nothing unusual in the Ozarks, until she saw it again that evening, idling at the far end of her street. The next morning, she found muddy boot prints on her porch steps, too large to be hers. And one night, when she gathered the courage to pull back the curtain, she saw a silhouette at the edge of the woods, still as a scarecrow, watching her house. The message was clear. The circle knew she was prying too deep, and they were reminding her that silence was not only their shield, it was their weapon. Fear is a strange thing. It does not always come as panic. Sometimes it seeps into your routines, warping everything you once thought ordinary. Margaret felt it when she poured her morning coffee, when she locked her office door, when she walked down hallways suddenly too quiet. The children's vacant stares haunted her, yes, but now it was Elijah's burning eyes she couldn't escape. Eyes that said, "You cannot break us without being broken yourself." She began to notice something else, too. Her colleagues grew strangely evasive when she mentioned the Sheltons. Case files disappeared from her desk. Supervisors urged her to let it go, their voices tight, their eyes avoiding hers. It was as if the silence that ruled the cabin had seeped outward into the very institutions that were supposed to protect the children. The circle wasn't just in the woods. It was in the county. It was in the system. And here is the realization that should chill you. Once silence becomes survival, it spreads like a virus. Those who see it feel powerless to resist. Those who resist are marked as enemies, and enemies of the circle do not last long. Margaret understood then that she was not just confronting a family's secrets. She was trespassing into a territory guarded by generations of fear, and fear, once weaponized, is deadlier than any gun. Margaret began to test the silence, probing where it ended. She spoke to neighbors, store clerks, even a local pastor, hoping someone might confirm what she'd seen in that cabin. But everywhere she turned, she encountered the same subtle resistance, smiles that froze, eyes that shifted away, voices that suddenly grew hushed. It was not denial. It was complicity. An old woman at the grocery store shook her head sharply when Margaret mentioned the name Shelton. A deputy at the county sheriff's office closed the file drawer a little too quickly when she asked for records. Even the pastor, whose sermons thundered against sin every Sunday, fell silent when she pressed about the children. His lips trembled, but he said only this: "Some things are older than law." That phrase lodged in Margaret's mind like a splinter. Older than law? What could be older than law, if not belief, if not blood? The truth dawned with a slow, sickening weight. The Sheltons were not hidden because the community was blind. They were hidden because the community chose to keep them hidden. People knew. They always had. But they had accepted it the way one accepts the weather or the shape of the hills. You did not fight it. You endured it. Because to fight, it meant to break the circle, and to break the circle meant inviting ruin. This is how corruption survives. Not in the shadows of total secrecy, but in the half-light of tolerated knowledge. When a whole town agrees to look away, a family like the Sheltons does not just survive, it thrives. And the silence becomes contagious, passed from neighbor to neighbor, until the circle expands beyond bloodlines and wraps itself around an entire community. Margaret felt the enormity of what she was up against. It was not Elijah and Martha alone. It was the unspoken pact of dozens, maybe hundreds, of people who would rather preserve their peace than cease. Enfront the rot. It was the sheriff's department, the church pews, the county offices, all bound not by chains, but by fear, by tradition, by the quiet belief that some secrets should remain untouched. Do you understand what that means? It means the Shelton cabin was never really isolated. It was protected, not by walls, but by silence. And silence, when shared, becomes impenetrable. Margaret realized then she was not trying to break a circle of one family. She was standing against the weight of an entire hidden order. Margaret dug deeper, desperate to understand how one family's obsession with blood could echo so precisely the language of supremacy she had read in those pamphlets. Late nights in the library became her ritual, combing through brittle newspapers, forgotten journals, and state archives no one bothered to touch anymore. That's when she found it, the connection she both dreaded and expected. In a dusty county record from the 1920s, she uncovered references to a state-sponsored sterilization program. Eugenics, they called it then. It was cloaked in scientific language, framed as progress, but the intent was the same as the Sheltons, to guard bloodlines, to erase what they deemed unfit. And right there, in the files, were names, families targeted, families spared, and among the spared, she saw it. Shelton. It was no accident. The Sheltons had not been ignored by history. They had been protected by it. Margaret traced the connections further. The rhetoric in Harold Shelton's father's papers, the warnings about outsider sickness and mongrelization were nearly word-for-word copies of eugenics tracts circulated in universities and state legislatures at the time. The Shelton family had not invented their doctrine in isolation. They had inherited it directly from the American mainstream, a mainstream that had once passed laws, written textbooks, and sterilized thousands in the name of purity. And here is the part that unsettled Margaret most. The doctrines of blood purity did not disappear. They were only buried. After the horrors of the Second World War, the language changed. The programs went underground, but the ideas survived. Families like the Sheltons became their keepers. Think about that for a moment. The cabin in the Ozarks was not an anomaly. It was a living fossil of America's own suppressed history, preserved in flesh and blood. Where universities abhor and done the language, the Sheltons whispered it to their children. Where politicians shredded the pamphlets, the Sheltons tucked them into drawers. What was rejected publicly still thrived privately. Margaret stared at the papers, her hands trembling. This was no longer just about saving children from neglect. This was about dragging into the light a chapter of history the nation had tried to erase. The Shelton Circle was a reminder, an indictment, that these ideas had never died. The circle had survived because it was never just a circle of kin. It was a circle of history, and history does not die when ignored. It festers, it waits, it whispers. Margaret thought she had found her weapon. Proof, documentation, records that linked the Shelton Creed not to madness, but to history. Ugly, undeniable, written in the state's own hand. She gathered her notes, made copies, and prepared to take them to the authorities. She believed, for a brief moment, that truth would finally crack the silence. But the reaction was not what she expected. At the county office, the clerk who handled vital records grew pale when she placed the documents on the desk. He didn't even look at them. He slid the folder back toward her and whispered, "Don't bring that here." His eyes darted toward the door as if someone were listening. At the sheriff's department, her request to file a formal complaint was met with a strange stillness. The deputy flipped through the pages slowly, too slowly, as if stalling for time. Finally, he closed the folder and said, "This isn't for us." His tone was flat, rehearsed. "You'd best take it up with the state." But when Margaret called the state office, she was met with silence on the line, followed by the abrupt click of a receiver. It became clear. The truth was not going to be welcomed. It was going to be buried. And that's when Margaret felt the full weight of what she had uncovered. The Sheltons were not just a family protected by local silence. They were tethered to something larger, an entire structure of forgotten policies and hidden complicities. To expose them was to expose a scar the nation itself had tried to cauterize, and no one in power wanted that wound reopened. The deeper horror settled over her. The silence wasn't just about protecting the Sheltons. It was about protecting memory itself. To acknowledge the cabin was to admit that the creed of purity had not vanished. It had simply been handed down, tucked away like a relic, while the nation looked the other way. Margaret drove home that night with her papers still in the passenger seat, her knuckles white on the wheel. For the first time, she realized she was not just fighting a family or a town. She was fighting an erasure, and erasures do not tolerate being undone. The question that gnawed at her was simple, brutal, inescapable. How many people had already been silenced for trying? The first sign came in the smallest of ways. Margaret returned home one evening to find her front door unlocked. She froze on the porch, heart pounding. Though she knew she had locked it that morning, inside, nothing seemed stolen, nothing broken. But on her desk, her neatly stacked notes had been disturbed. Pages shifted, folders misaligned. Someone had been there. Someone had read her work. That night, the phone rang just past midnight. When she answered, there was no voice, only breathing, slow, steady, listening. She slammed the receiver down, her hands shaking, but when it rang again, minutes later, she could not bring herself to pick it up. The sound of it filled the house, an accusation in every ring. "You are not alone." The next morning, half her photocopies were gone. She had left them in her locked office drawer. Now the drawer was empty. Her supervisor claimed ignorance, but his tight smile told her everything. The silence was no longer local. It had hands that reached into her work, her home, her very nights. The fear became physical. She stopped sleeping, jolted awake by every creak of the floorboards. She drove different routes to work, only to find the same truck behind her, no matter which road she chose. She taped her windows shut, but still she swore she saw figures at the tree line, watching. The message was clear: stop digging, or you will be buried with what you find. But fear does strange things to a mind. For some, it paralyzes. For others, it sharpens into defiance. Margaret felt both at once. She wanted to run, to leave the county and never speak the name Shelton again. Yet another part of her burned hotter with every intrusion. If they were this desperate to silence her, then what she had uncovered must be far more dangerous than she realized. It was no longer just about the children. It was about a secret worth guarding with intimidation, with erasure, maybe even with blood. Margaret stared at her scattered notes late into the night, her eyes raw with exhaustion. She knew she had crossed a threshold. From this point forward, she was not merely researching history. She was living inside its shadow, and history, when threatened, strikes back. And deep down, she understood. The circle had marked her. It was raining the night they came. Margaret had stayed late at the office, photocopying what little evidence she had left, when the power flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. The building sank into darkness, the only sound the steady hum of the storm outside. She fumbled for her flashlight, her breath shallow, every nerve screaming that this was no ordinary outage. As she made her way to the stairwell, she heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Not the shuffle of a janitor, but the slow, patient tread of someone who knew she was there. The beam of her flashlight caught a shadow at the landing below. Tall, broad, unmoving. She froze. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then the figure retreated silently into the dark. She bolted. Out the side door, into the rain, her papers pressed against her chest. That's when she saw it. The same old pickup truck, idling at the far end of the lot, headlights off. She ran to her car, fumbling the keys, praying the engine would start. As she pulled out, the truck's lights flared to life, blinding her through the downpour. It followed close, far too close, its beams filling her mirrors like a predator's eyes. For miles it stayed on her tail, matching every turn. The storm swallowed the world in sheets of water, wipers useless against the flood. Finally, at a narrow stretch of road with ditches on either side, the truck surged forward, swerving into her lane, forcing her toward the edge. Tires screamed. She fought the wheel, the mud sucking her car dangerously close to the ditch, and then, as suddenly as it appeared, the truck braked, fell back, and vanished into the curtain of rain. Margaret pulled over, shaking uncontrollably, chest heaving, the papers scattered across her seat. It hadn't been a bluff this time. It had been a warning, sharp and unmistakable. Next time, there would be no retreat. She sat there in the seas, a storm, soaked in fear and fury, and realized the truth she had tried so hard to deny. This was no longer about investigation. It was survival. The circle did not just guard its silence. They enforced it with force, with pursuit, with the willingness to erase her entirely. And Margaret, trembling in the rain, understood with cold certainty, if she kept pushing, she would not be spared. Margaret could have left. That night in the rain, she could have driven straight out of the county, left the Shelton name to rot in the mud of forgotten history. Many would have. Most did. But Margaret was not built for surrender. The closer the circle pressed, the more she burned to break it. She began moving underground. No more open calls to state offices, no more visits to county desks. She worked in whispers, trading favors with archivists who kept collections off the books, meeting librarians in basements long stripped of fluorescent light. And in those hidden stacks, she found others, faint traces of people who had once tried to shine a light on the same shadows. An unsigned letter from the 1950s warning of families that police their own purity with roots in old sterilization boards. A transcript from a journalist's unfinished expose in the 1970s, abruptly cut off after only 2 installments. Notes scribbled in the margins of an anthropology thesis, describing secluded cabins where blood is guarded by silence and silence by violence. The pattern became undeniable. The Sheltons were not alone. There were other circles, scattered across the country like buried embers of the same fire. Mountain hollows, desert compounds, even decayed city blocks, always isolated, always denied by neighbors, always defended with an intensity that defied logic. What chilled Margaret most was the recurrence of certain phrases, identical across decades, across states. The circle must not be broken. Blood is the first law. Some things are older than law. These weren't coincidences. They were signatures, proof of an unspoken network of belief, echoing through families that had never met, yet spoke the same tongue of secrecy. Margaret realized she had stumbled not onto a single family's madness, but a hidden archive of America's forbidden lineage, circles that had survived. Every wave of reform, every moral reckoning. By going quiet, retreating into the folds of memory until the time was safe to whisper again. She sat in the dim light of a basement archive, the papers spread before her like bones pulled from the earth, and felt a terrible awe. This wasn't just history repeating. This was history refusing to die. The Sheltons were a single thread in a web that spanned generations, a web she had begun to tug without understanding how wide it stretched. And now she knew, once you see the web, you can never unsee it, and the web sees you back. The name appeared in the margin of a half-burned folder. Daniel Harker, 1983. Margaret nearly dismissed it as just another fragment, but something about the scrawled note, "Still alive?" made her pause. A survivor, someone who hadn't been erased. She tracked him down through old addresses, dead phone numbers, and finally, a contact in a neighboring state who whispered, "If you find him, don't tell him I sent you." She drove 3 hours to a rusted trailer park on the edge of nowhere. The place felt abandoned, its gravel lot choked with weeds, but one unit still had smoke curling from its chimney. Margaret knocked, heart hammering. The man who opened the door was gaunt, his hair long and unkempt, his eyes darting past her to scan the empty road before settling on her face. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. His voice was wrecked by cigarettes and something heavier, decades of fear. "I found your name in the archives," Margaret said. "I think you tried to do what I'm doing now." At that, he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. He let her in, but the blinds stayed shut, the locks double-bolted. His trailer was a tomb of yellowed newspapers, notebooks, cassette tapes labeled in shaky handwriting. "You want to know what it cost me?" he asked, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "They ruined me, my job, my marriage, my mind. Said I was unstable, paranoid, obsessed. Maybe I am. But tell me this." He shoved a stack of photos across the table. Blurred images of cabins, strange markings carved into wood, circles painted on doors in blood-red pigment. "If I'm crazy, then how come they keep following me 40 years on?" Margaret listened, every word sinking into her bones. Harker spoke of nights where trucks idled outside his home until dawn, of manuscripts stolen in fires that just happened to start, of colleagues who distanced themselves until he was a ghost in his own life. "They don't kill you fast," he whispered. "They make you disappear slow. You're still walking, but nobody believes you exist." When she asked about the Sheltons, he went quiet, crushing his cigarette into the ashtray with violent precision. "That family?" His voice dropped. "They're not the end of it. They're the echo. The circle's bigger, older. You can't fight it. You can only survive it, if it lets you." Margaret drove away shaken, her stomach knotted with dread. Daniel Harker was a ruin, a warning carved into flesh and bone. And yet, even broken as he was, his survival proved something the Sheltons feared most. Silence could be broken. Margaret sat at her desk, dawn creeping through the curtains, surrounded by stacks of papers, copies, recordings, photographs. Everything she had gathered from archives, from whispered sources, from the ruined testimony of Daniel Harker. For weeks, fear had kept her paralyzed, but Harker's broken eyes haunted her. If she did nothing, she'd end up like him, a ghost, alive but erased. So she made her choice. She typed through the night, assembling a manuscript, a dossier of the Shelton family and the wider network of circles. It was raw, fragmented, but undeniable. Names, dates, rituals, scars of forgotten policies woven into modern silence. She drafted letters to journalists, activists, historians. She prepared to send it all in one massive burst, scattering her findings so wide the circle could never smother it all. But courage has a scent, and the circle caught it. The first sign came as she printed the final pages. Every light in her house flickered once, then went black. Silence fell heavy, unnatural. Margaret reached for her phone. Dead. She tried the lamp. Dead. Only the faint hiss of rain against the window broke the stillness. Then came the sound. A scrape at the back door. Slow, deliberate, a hand dragging something across the wood. She froze, every muscle screaming. Another scrape, this time at the front door. She realized with a sickening chill they weren't trying to break in. They were circling her. Headlights flashed outside, sweeping across her walls. A truck idled in the road, its engine growling like an animal. Shadows moved against the window glass, tall, silent figures. Margaret grabbed her notes, shoving them into envelopes, stuffing copies into every bag, every jacket pocket. Her hands shook, but she refused to stop. Then came the knock. 3 heavy pounds on the door. Not frantic, not rushed, measured, as if the one knocking already knew there was no way out. Her breath caught as she realized they weren't here to scare her anymore. They were here to end it. Margaret backed into her study, clutching the papers like a shield, her heart thundering in her ears. Every instinct told her to burn it all, to surrender, to vanish before they took her too. But she thought of Harker. She thought of the children in the photographs. She thought of every erased voice she had uncovered in the archives, and she whispered to herself, trembling but defiant, "Not this time." The knock came again, louder, and the circle stepped closer. The pounding grew heavier, rattling the frame. Margaret knew she had seconds, maybe less. She shoved the last of her papers into a padded envelope and slipped a USB drive into its folds. Her hands fumbled at the laptop, her breath ragged, as she cued the email blast she had prepared for weeks. 100 recipients, journalists, scholars, whistleblowers, even strangers chosen at random. One keystroke, and the silence would crack. The front door groaned, wood splintered. Shadows stretched across her hallway as the circle forced its way inside. Their footsteps were steady, not rushed, because they already believed they had won. Margaret hovered over the send key, paralyzed for a moment. She thought of her mother's voice, telling her as a child to leave old things buried. She thought of the whispering archivists, the warnings, the dead phone calls in the night. And then she thought of the children, their faces blurred in the photographs, their names erased from records, their lives swallowed by silence. The door burst open. Figures filled the room, faces hidden in hoods, eyes blank with intent. One stepped forward, raising a hand as if to claim what was his by right. Margaret met that gaze, her pulse steady now, her fear burned into something harder. She pressed the key. Send. The laptop chimed once, faint and triumphant, just as the first hand closed around her wrist. Papers scattered, the room erupted in chaos, shouts, the crash of overturned furniture, the hiss of rain carried in through the broken doorway. Margaret fought, clawing, screaming, but the circle swallowed her, dragging her into its darkness. And then, silence. Her house was left in ruins. The truck outside vanished before dawn. Neighbors claimed they heard nothing. When police arrived, there was no sign of Margaret Shelton. No body, no struggle, nothing but a ransacked study and an open laptop on Tico. Desk, its screen gone dark. But by then, it was too late. The emails had already left. Across the country, inboxes began to ping. Archivists opened attachments they had never expected to see. Journalists stared in disbelief at names and dates too precise to dismiss. Online forums buzzed with whispers of an unbroken chain, a hidden circle that had just been forced into the light. Margaret had vanished, yes, but her silence had been broken, and once a secret escapes into the world, it can never truly be buried again.